Here's a story that's surprisingly common. A father spends 30 years building a business from nothing. Long hours, missed birthdays, sacrifices nobody outside the family ever sees. He finally sells it, retires comfortably, and passes something down to his kids. 15 years later, it's gone. Not stolen, not lost in a crash, just spent. Quietly, slowly, until there was nothing left to show for it. Why does that happen so often? And why do a small number of families seem to avoid it, generation after generation? Almost like they're playing a different game with the same money everyone else has? My name is Marcus, and on this channel, we talk about the psychology behind money, why smart people make the financial choices they make, and what's really happening underneath the numbers. Today, we're going to look at something researchers sometimes call the family bank mindset. Not a special account, not a legal trick, a completely different way of relating to money, one that treats it less like something you win and more like something you're temporarily responsible for. By the end of this video, you'll understand why most family wealth disappears, what a small number of families do differently, and how that same thinking can change the way you handle money right now, even if you're nowhere near generational wealth territory. If you enjoy learning about money, investing, and building long-term wealth, consider subscribing, liking the video, and turning on notifications so you don't miss future content. Now, let's get into it. There's an old saying that shows up in almost every culture, worded slightly differently each time. In English, it's shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. In Chinese, it's wealth never survives 3 generations. In Italian, from stalls to stars to stalls. Different countries, same observation, made centuries before anyone had a word for behavioral economics, and modern research backs it up. A widely cited study from the Williams Group, which spent years studying wealthy families, found that around 70% of wealth transfers fail by the time they reach the 2nd generation, and about 90% fail by the 3rd. Most people hear a number like that and assume it's about bad investing or greedy relatives or a business that failed. Sometimes that's true, but the research points somewhere else most of the time. The Williams Group found that the overwhelming majority of failures came down to breakdowns in communication and trust within the family, not poor financial decisions. In other words, the money didn't disappear because of a bad stock pick. It disappeared because nobody had a shared understanding of what the money was actually for. That's worth sitting with for a second. We tend to think of wealth as a math problem. Earn enough, invest wisely, don't overspend, and the money takes care of itself. But money doesn't move through a family like a spreadsheet. It moves through relationships, and relationships are messy, emotional, and full of unspoken assumptions. So here's the real question underneath all of this. If breakdowns in trust and communication cause most wealth to disappear, what do the families who succeed actually believe about money that the rest of us were never taught? Most of us grew up with a fairly simple mental model of money. You earn it, you spend it, and when it runs low, you go earn more. Nothing wrong with that model. It's how the vast majority of people live, and it works fine for covering rent, groceries, and the occasional vacation. The problem is that this model has a hidden ceiling built into it. If money only exists to be earned and spent, then every generation effectively starts from zero. Grandpa's hard work buys Grandpa a good life. Then it's gone, and the kids are back to square one, earning and spending their own cycle, over and over. Families who build lasting wealth tend to operate from a different mental model, whether or not they could ever explain it in these terms. They treat money less like a paycheck and more like a tool that's supposed to keep working long after the person who earned it is gone. Economists sometimes call this long-time horizon thinking, and psychologists connect it to a much older concept, delayed gratification. You've probably heard of the marshmallow test, the famous study from Stanford psychologist Walter Mischel in the late 1960s. Researchers put a marshmallow in front of a child and told them if they could wait 15 minutes without eating it, they'd get a second one. Some kids waited, most didn't. What made the original study so interesting wasn't the marshmallow itself, it was the follow-up research years later, which found that the children who were able to wait tended to show better outcomes in several areas of life down the road. Now, later researchers have pushed back on how strong that link really is once you control for family income and background, and that's an important nuance. But the core idea still holds up in a broader sense. The ability to tolerate short-term discomfort for a longer-term reward is a skill, not a personality trait you're simply born with. And it's a skill that shows up constantly in how wealth-building families talk about money. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Delayed gratification alone doesn't explain the family bank mindset. Plenty of disciplined savers still end up with kids who blow through an inheritance. There's a second ingredient, and it's less about math and more about psychology. It's trust. Think about what an inheritance actually requires, emotionally. One generation has to trust that the next generation will handle money responsibly, and the next generation has to trust that the money isn't a leash, that it's not being used to control them or measure their worth. When that trust is missing, strange things happen. Parents attach conditions and guilt to money. Kids either rebel against it by overspending or freeze up and never learn to manage it at all because they were never given real practice. There's a concept in behavioral economics called mental accounting, first described by economist Richard Thaler. It's the idea that we don't treat all money the same, even though a dollar is a dollar. We treat found money differently than earned money. We treat inheritance differently than a paycheck. Studies on lottery winners and inheritance recipients consistently show that money that feels unearned tends to get spent faster and with less thought than money that was worked for. That's not a character flaw. It's just how the human brain files different kinds of money into different mental buckets. This is exactly why families who successfully preserve wealth rarely just hand over a lump sum and hope for the best. Instead, many involve younger generations early, sometimes as teenagers, in small financial decisions. Not a fortune, a modest fund, a small business decision, a discussion about where a charitable gift should go. The amount barely matters. What matters is that the money stops feeling like found treasure and starts feeling like a responsibility they've had practice carrying. So we've got long-time horizons, we've got trust, and we've got shared responsibility. But there's still a piece missing. Why does one family manage to hold all of this together while another, with just as much money and just as much love, falls apart? The turning point isn't really about money at all. It's about identity. Somewhere along the way, wealth-preserving families stop asking, "How do I make sure I get mine?" and start asking, "How do we make sure this keeps serving the people who come after me?" That's a completely different question, and it changes almost every decision that follows from it. Once you see money as something you're stewarding, rather than something you own outright, your decisions start to shift in small but meaningful ways. You think twice before an impulsive purchase, not out of guilt, but because you're aware the money has a longer job to do. You have honest conversations about finances with your kids earlier, not because you're trying to control them, but because you understand that silence is what breaks trust, not money itself. You stop measuring success purely by how much you can spend on yourself this year, and you start measuring it by whether the next generation will be in a stronger position than you were. This doesn't require millions of dollars to matter. A family that teaches its kids how compound interest works, that talks openly about a modest inheritance instead of avoiding the subject, that treats a small emergency fund as something the whole family protects together rather than something one person hoards, is practicing the exact same psychology as a family with 100 times the assets. The mindset scales down just as easily as it scales up. There's also a quiet peace that comes with this shift. When you stop treating money purely as a personal scoreboard, a lot of the anxiety around it eases. You're not competing with your neighbors or your siblings. You're building something with a longer arc than your own lifetime, and that takes some of the pressure off any single decision. So what does this actually look like in a normal life, without a trust fund or a family office? A few gentle shifts tend to matter more than any specific financial product. One is simply talking about money earlier and more openly than most families do. You don't need to disclose every number, but even a loose, honest conversation about how decisions get made removes a lot of the mystery that breeds mistrust later. Another is involving the next generation in small financial decisions while the stakes are still low, so that responsibility feels familiar rather than overwhelming when the stakes eventually rise. A third is reframing what you're saving for. Instead of only saving for your own retirement or your own goals, it can help to occasionally ask what a decision today makes possible for someone down the line, even if that someone is just a slightly older version of yourself. And finally, it helps to separate a windfall from your everyday money in your own mind. If you ever receive an inheritance, a bonus, or unexpected money, giving yourself a short pause before spending it, even just a few weeks, gives your brain time to move it out of that found money mental bucket and treat it with the same care as money you worked for. None of these are dramatic changes. Nobody needs to sell their house or start a family foundation this week. They're small redirections in how you think, and small redirections held consistently are usually what separates families who keep wealth from families who keep starting over. Generational wealth was never really about the size of the inheritance. It's about whether a family learned to trust each other with money, talk about it honestly, and think a little further down the road than the next paycheck. That's genuinely learnable, no matter where you're starting from. And understanding this doesn't mean judging your own family's history. It just means you get to be the one who starts a different pattern. If this kind of thing helps you think about money differently, it would mean a lot if you subscribed and left a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. But more than anything, I hope you walk away from this with a simple, quiet shift. The point was never to hoard money for the sake of a legacy. It's to build something steady enough that the people you love don't have to start from zero. And I want to ask you something. If you could hand down one financial lesson to the next generation of your family, not money, just a lesson, what would it be? Let me know in the comments. Because I read every single one.